Hello, you're watching RPTV News, and my name is Fabio Heredia Castellans. Regent Park is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Toronto, with European descendant Caucasians making up less than 30% of the population. South Asian, Black, Chinese, and Southeast Asians collectively make up the majority of the population in Regent Park. In today's interview, I will be talking to Paulos Gebreyesus, the Executive Director of Regent Park Health Center, to address why race is an important determinant of someone's health outcomes. Specifically, we will be looking at how ethno-racial data collection is a necessary tool to address these social determinants of health, including race. Through our discussion, I hope to better understand the correlation between health and race and why anti-racist activists are saying that anti-black and anti-indigenous racism is a health crisis in this country.
Okay, hello Fabio. It's great to be here with Regent Park Focus, a very important community partner to the Regent Park CHC for many, many years. My name is Paulos Gebreyesus. I'm currently the Executive Director at the Regent Park CHC, and I've been here in the Regent Park neighborhood for almost 4 years now. And prior to that, I was involved in community health work in other neighborhoods, in particular in Lawrence Heights, in the former city of York, and in that work, I have been engaged in lots of harm reduction and street outreach work, in the Pathways to Education program, in working with resident leaders within TCH neighborhoods, and revitalization. So happy to be here with you to talk
Yeah.
about community health.
Did you want to add anything about Regent Park Community Health Center before we move on to talk about race and data?
Sure. Just by way of context and background, um, I will say that I have been part of the community health center movement in this province in Ontario since the year 2000. And I was drawn to the community health centers because of my previous experience in working in more ethno-specific spaces, doing refugee settlement work. And when I started to explore what the role of community health centers is, I learned that they are established on the principles of the social determinants of health, which takes the mandates of a community health center well beyond clinical or medical services, because the social determinants of health include elements like safe and secure housing, social inclusion, income, education, and increasingly race. And so it takes us beyond the clinic and into community and into what we would refer to as health equity,
Right.
because we've learned that those are really the drivers of how healthy somebody is. In urban settings, in many cases, income is the largest and most important factor with regards to how healthy somebody is.
Right. So the context is such an important factor that is not necessarily included in more traditional approaches. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. And so the evolution of community health centers or the development of community health centers has incorporated community health workers, community development workers, and a whole set of other providers and resources and partnerships that are very much embedded in the community. And this is not only in the staffing, but also that community health centers are community governed. So we are a not-for-profit organization. We're governed by a community board of directors that are recruited from, in many cases, from within the neighborhood, as well as other volunteers.
Why is ethno-racial data collection important for a community like Regent Park? Why is it important in general, and also why is it important for a community like Regent Park?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question, and I'll try and keep my comments kind of short and brief, but in the history of equity and health equity, we have learned that organizations and institutions have their own logic and their own narrative. And in many cases, the perspectives of what's actually happening and the impact of those agencies and institutions isn't fully understood by those who actually operate and manage those resources. So, so for example, if we did not have information that is collected on any range of health outcomes, we would not understand what it is that what we should be improving, what it is that we should be prioritizing, or even if there's a problem. So the collection of relevant information in order to better understand the impact of the work that we do is a long-standing, it's part of the whole scientific, logical sort of approach to organizing work and services. And we do so very diligently, with some notable exceptions. And so this is where it's helpful to gather that information in order to compare and better understand patterns that may not be as visible to an individual anecdotally. Or perhaps they are visible anecdotally, but there's no proof, as it were, that this is a larger systemic issue. So the whole idea of collecting all of the information is to be able to actually study that information to discern those patterns. In this case, we know that even though COVID, as an example, came to us primarily as a physical or biological threat, and that it is a virus that is highly infectious, that human beings are contagious and are at risk of, that it is life-threatening. We understand the sort of biological basis and rapidly learning more about it.
Right.
But what we find when we apply that social determinant of health is, again, we'll find that all of those elements of who you are in society have a huge role to play in either increasing your vulnerability and risk, or in providing you with protective factors that reduce your risk of getting COVID. So a simple example is, for something that is going to be passed from person to person, we were all under lockdown. And if you happen to have to live in a dwelling where there is sufficient living space and amenities for everybody in that household to remain distant from each other, then you have a far higher likelihood of not getting COVID or surviving COVID. If you have sufficient income to where you don't need to take public transit, or you don't need to be in your job, then again, you have these protective factors. So in the same way, we've learned over generations that there are systemic patterns to how we have organized ourselves as Torontonians or as Ontarians. Many years ago, when the first studies on incarceration were first released, is how we better understand the impact of how law is enforced, where it's enforced, who is policed, who is not policed, and helps us to understand, even though we may not understand how it happened, we know what has happened. So if we see, for example, the rates of incarceration among Indigenous peoples, or people who are who identify as Black or who are racialized, then and compare that to the size of that subpopulation within our community, we would expect, if things were all equal, that a population that is only 3% in the general community would only have somewhere very close to 3% within the population that's currently incarcerated. And so when we see a rate that says 20% of all incarcerated people are indigenous, then we know that we have a systemic issue, and that we need to work at dismantling that and addressing that and responding to that. And so, so I think the data really points us to where things are not equitable. And so that response to addressing that, to capturing that information and then responding to it, which I would call health equity, is the rationale for why we want to go out and collect as much information about different facets of who we are as individuals.
You feel like there's some kind of active push against something like data collection because it would further legitimize the voices that are currently being ignored by some of these institutional institutions. I'm not sure if that was clear, but
no, it is, and for sure, I would agree with that statement. It is, it challenges sometimes the narrative that all is well and swell in Canada. I think it, so gathering this data and demonstrating that we are a product of our colonial history here in Canada. We are reminded that many of our organizations, our institutions, had a very different mandate not so very long ago. That many of our, what we consider to be mainstream services, were not designed for you know, those communities that we now recognize as being marginalized or being racialized. So, so when we think about, let's say, the TDSB or the school system, it was never designed with the needs of Indigenous children or Black children. It was designed with the assumption that that system was going to be designed by, staffed by Caucasian Canadians to educate Caucasian kids. Those were the norms, those were the standards, and it wasn't even articulated in that way because no one else was even there. So it wasn't
was implied.
It was implied, and it was reinforced. And we continue to see on the outcomes of students who that system was designed for and who is who for whom it functions well and for whom it does not function well. So I think that's absolutely I think an enabling factor to dismantling colonialism and to engaging in active anti-racism work within, in my case, within health, within community health.
What is the connection between defund the police protests and health? Why is racism a health issue for Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
Yeah, there's it is a big and sometimes complicated issue, but I'm so pleased that the Toronto Police Services has, since last year, been capturing race-based data. It's a much needed change, and it confirms, I think, some of the concerns that members of the Black community have been expressing, and which was far easily dismissed prior to that data emerging. And so as the conversation around profiling and how Toronto Police was organizing its resources to focus on particular neighborhoods was clearly perpetuating that kind of systemic racism that exists. So I think there will be more and more, and with health, there's, it's still somewhat controversial, less so today perhaps than a few months ago, but it's still, it's not without its risks to gather this information, to pull that that data together, and to develop some hypotheses and some strategies based on that information. There's certainly risks that are involved in all of that, and I appreciate the comments and concerns related to collecting race-based information. I do feel, however, that the benefits far outweigh the risks in collecting that information. There's no doubt that in the history of racism, rarely have institutions and systems been have used that information to benefit the community. And so the historic distrust of disclosing information to systems and to institutions is a survival strategy that people who have lived under colonialism, who have lived under racism, have rightly developed. So I think that's it does not surprise me that there are concerns around that. However, I will suggest that the gathering of this information, we are an information society. We respond to information. Our systems and institutions respond to certain types of information more effectively than others. So, so I think this is why it's important to also have reflected these realities in a statistical or in a data form to reinforce the narratives that individuals and communities have been asserting. For however long there's been racism and colonialism, there has been a resistance to them. And so there's an evolution of how that's communicated and some real opportunities for us in the community to also understand and control that data and to make our own conclusions about what's happening.
Because data is raw information, different people may seek to use the data to further their own narratives. Do you see this data having the potential to change the mind of a racist, for example?
Well, I mean, you know, I acknowledge that there are going to be folks on either end of that spectrum that won't let fact get in the way of them knowing something. But I think there are many of us who continue to have an open mind, who are interested in learning and understanding and improving the outcomes of our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, our fellow Canadians, Torontonians, and so I think that's the population that I think I speak for. I imagine there's lots of conspiracies, and there is lots of racism that continues to some very, you know, very like very obvious kind of racism that continues to be present with us. And so we do need to counteract that with good solid information that is not an opinion.
Right.
It is a statistical reality. It is evidence that things are not as equitable as we sometimes think that they are. For those who don't have that lived experience, they will need this kind of information to convince them that we do have to change and adjust how it is that we organize, plan, and deliver and evaluate the services that we offer to the community. And these are services that are funded by the general public, but the benefits of those services are not as equitable as they should be. So, and that's the ultimate aim that we're working towards, is a more equitable community, because we see that that's what's good for everybody, that everyone will benefit from that. Those who may not understand the correlations between childhood poverty and incarceration are, if that's not their lived experience, if they're not in those same neighborhoods, they may be completely oblivious and not understand the underlying factors that lead to those patterns. So that's all the data does, is it points us to pursue our work in specific directions. So that data is our driver.
What are your thoughts on Kristyn Wong-Tam and Josh Matlow's motion to defund the police by 10%, in contrast to Black Lives Matters protesters who wanted a minimum of 50% and even a full abolition? How could this redistributed funding be used to promote the health of the Regent Park community and others like it?
I was actually quite disappointed that that motion was not carried by City Council, and in some ways, it doesn't really surprise me when I look at the representation at Council. That Council does not represent Torontonians in any way, shape, or form, and certainly not with regards to um, the pros and cons of policing. So I think this is a concept that's long overdue. I don't think we had that phrase, defund the police, in the way that it's now a little bit of a rallying cry. But I will say that the 10% is I don't know how they landed at the 10%, but it is a direction, and I thought potentially a viable one to explore. I would not be I would not have been as supportive if the call was to completely abolish the police services. I think that requires a whole lot of thinking and planning and time to get there. But I certainly do want to push back hard on this incredibly um, over overexpanded scope of policing. Just a few years ago, we had inserted police officers in almost all of our high schools. I'm really pleased that's no longer the case. I'm really pleased we're no longer funding the TAVIS task force. I am very concerned about the implications of continuing to call police when somebody is in distress, is in a mental health distress. I don't think that Toronto Police Service personnel are equipped, trained to respond to those. And so I think there are significant chunks. I'll go further. I'm not convinced that even the broader community health agenda should be owned by law enforcement. I think community safety is rightfully owned by the community.
Right.
I come from a culture and history for restorative justice, and what we have is, as some have said, a sort of line from schools to prisons in neighborhoods like Regent Park.
Yeah.
In in another neighborhood, so I would suggest that a young Black male person who is kind of middle of the road, not the most intelligent, not the one always struggling, not the one that has some social skills and is just kind of going through childhood and adolescence in Regent Park, has a very high risk of ending up being criminalized in some way, shape, or form. Whereas that same young person, if they were not Black and if they're growing up in Rosedale, middle of the road kid, might end up being a dentist.
Right.
And so I think it's a very, very different reality for young people in neighborhoods like Regent Park. And I see policing and police violence as a significant risk to people's safety and well-being. I'm not sure that those tremendous resources that we pour into Toronto Police Services as Torontonians is necessarily giving us the value and the safety that we all hope for. So I am in principle very supportive of the movement towards defunding of police, and I see it both from a health, in particular mental health and addictions perspective, and I also see it from the concern of racism and that colonial history that we, I think, continue to perpetuate through our policing.
Right. Yeah, I think just what you just said is it really is a thing also about like what is the priority and are we using the police to create a model of like a healthy community that is potentially somehow based on removing certain people, criminalizing certain people, and and you know,
and shooting others.
and killing, yes, and just the figures alone, I guess, as a health professional, in terms of like the funding of the police being significantly over $1 billion, whereas for health, I think it was like 800 million or something.
Any closing comments?
I will just maybe add by speaking about my excitement about the social development plan in Regent Park, and which we call the SDP and the stakeholder table, and the process for engaging residents, for empowering residents through that process. I think is an opportunity of a lifetime. I think very few communities have the capacities and assets that Regent Park has to mount such an ambitious project. We are, I think, 12 or 13 years into revitalization, and we have at least another 10 years of tremendous change ahead of us. I think in pace with the physical redevelopment, I'd love to see that social transformation of the neighborhood. Already we've established the 4 pillars around safety, around communication, around community development, and about employment and economic opportunities, 4 areas of priority that I'm really excited to participate and facilitate with other change makers in the neighborhood. So thank you for this time, and I look forward to showing up at some other time and having another conversation with you on this.
Oh, thank you so much. That would mean a lot. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. And we will keep in touch. All right. Thanks so much.
All right, Fabio. All the best.
Thanks again, Paulos Gebreyesus, for really emphasizing that connection between health and race and other social determinants of health. And I saw that there was a lot of negative press associated to the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in the context of COVID-19, primarily from people who did not understand this connection, that the reason that people are out here protesting has to do with the fact that the thing that they are actually protesting is itself a greater a greater determinant of their health outcomes than even COVID-19, or in most cases it's going to be an interconnected issue. So thank you for highlighting that connection to help people better understand why anti-Black racism is a social determinant of health, and why it is important that we collect this ethno-racial specific data to better cater our services to specific communities like the ones that we find in Regent Park.
Like, share, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social media platforms. Don't forget to check out our website, and please comment below